mind, if you'll get out your phones and check yourself in. We've already done it. Any questions, just feel free to ask. Or if it doesn't work, we do need to go over something rather quickly. As you know, I do record the WebEx lectures that we do here. Please remind me to record it, okay? Because I do have a tendency to forget, so I really do mean it when I say somebody remind me if I haven't recorded it. Also, if you want a copy of the lecture in class, no problem. That's the whole reason why I'm doing it. The trick is, when you send me an email asking for it, it's really important that you tell me which specific class that you're in, okay? Because I teach multiple classes and I have multiple recordings. So if you just email me and say, can I have a copy of today's lecture, I'm going to have to say, which lecture are you talking about? So tell me exactly which class we're talking about, so it makes it a lot easier for me to do that. Are we cool on that? Matter of fact, any email that you send to any instructor, it's important that you give your first name, your last name, what class you're in. They need that identifying information to help you out, but definitely with the lectures. Okay. Let's go ahead and get going. No, we don't need to look at him. We were talking about Alfred Wegener, weren't we? And how he came up with the theory, which we now know happens to be true, of plate tectonics. And that is a series of subterranean plates that the continents are resting on. They are in a constant state of shift. They are moving against each other, into each other. All kinds of different types of motions are taking place. And they have caused the continents to move all over the place. And so the Earth looks very different every few million years. Now, there's one unique phenomenon that we definitely need to know about, and that is when one tectonic plate goes straight into another tectonic plate, when they're just, straight up, crashing into each other. We're dealing with global forces here. We're dealing with, forces that are part of the Earth itself, and something's got to give. At some point when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, somebody's going to have to give way. And what happens in this situation most of the time is a process that we call subduction. One tectonic plate starts getting forced underneath the other tectonic plate. They just start, one starts going underneath the other, and that causes just a collision that crunches up the Earth's crust, and it also creates a trench where the subduction is actually taking place. And so we see a trench, and then we see the Earth crunching up. And the Earth crunching up, of course, creates mountains. That's what the mountains are. And there's a couple of subduction zones. I know it's a little hard to see, but one is right along South America. There's a plate that is going into South America, and it has created, I keep touching the board, it has created what we call the Atacama Trench, but it has also pushed up the Andes Mountains. And so the Andes are absolutely gigantic mountain range along the western coast of South America. This is such a powerful force that the continent itself has actually been seesawed from one direction to the other over the course of millions of years. And of course, because this is the Earth's crust that is getting crunched up into the air, all of the minerals in the Earth's crust now becomes minerals in the mountains. And that's why mountain ranges often have a lot of mineral deposits in them. They have iron ore and gold and silver and copper and tin and all sorts of elements, because those elements exist in the Earth's crust. Now they exist in the mountains. Another subduction zone that's happening is the Indian plate is crunching up into the Eurasian plate, and that has created the Himalayas. One plate is just crunching into another, and it is slowly happening. And there's other places around the world where it's taking place too. So that's a tectonic activity that we definitely need to be aware of. And that, of course, also creates a huge amount of heat. And so there's a lot of volcanoes, a lot of volcanic activity also happens there. Now, so plate tectonics are part of what changes the physical Earth. Also, what changes the physical Earth is weather and climate. Weather and climate changes the physical Earth. And these are two specific terms. The weather is what you're experiencing today. It's rainy outside. That's today's weather. Climate is the general activity that we can measure over the course of time. For example, Death Valley has a hot, dry, arid climate. It's a desert. Even though the temperature of Death Valley may fluctuate from one day to the next, the climate of Death Valley is a specific way. You get the difference. Now, what we need to understand is that the climate of the earth and the climate in various regions of the earth has shifted substantially throughout the course of Earth's existence. It fluctuates considerably, and a lot of this has to do with how the earth goes around the sun. You see, the earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees, and it goes around the sun. How long does it take for it to make one rotation? Yeah, 365 and a quarter days, right? That's why a year has 365 days in it. Well, as the earth is going around the sun, right, as the earth is on its journey, it also wibbles and wobbles a little. Okay, it isn't perfectly smooth as it goes around. And so sometimes it wibbles a little off 23.5 degrees. Sometimes it goes in the other direction. Sometimes this can happen over the course of a few years. Sometimes it can do this over the course of a few decades or centuries. It's a wobbly planet. And what that does is change the angle that the sun's rays hit the earth. And when you change that angle just a little bit, you're going to change the climate. The earth is going to get colder, the earth is going to get warmer, so on and so forth. And even the sun itself, even though it's a big hot ball of plasma out there, a giant nuclear reaction, the sun itself changes in intensity ever so slightly from time to time. And of course, a minor change in the sun's intensity is also going to play a role in how it affects the earth. Now again, that has not made the earth uninhabitable or inhospitable for life, but what it does do is cause ice ages, and it causes times where it warms up. About 20 million years ago, the earth began to cool considerably. The earth wibbled a certain way, and it got quite a bit colder. It got quite a bit colder. And much of the earth ended up covered in glaciers. Much of the earth ended up covered in glaciers because you see the snow fell, but the snow did not melt into water and drain back into the ocean. And so ice started piling up in what had previously been warmer, dry land. About 3 million years ago, the earth entered what we call the Pleistocene epoch. The earth entered what we call the Pleistocene epoch. And yep, you can't read it because it's purple. We need to turn it red. But the Pleistocene epoch, and this was about 3 million years ago. And this has been a period of substantial fluctuation. For the last 3 million years, the earth has gotten warm and gotten cold quite a bit more in these cycles than in earlier geological eras. And so the glaciers have moved forward, and then they've retreated, and they've moved forward, and then they've retreated. Right now, we are living in what is known as the Holocene. Whoops. The Holocene era of this Pleistocene epoch. And this started around 15,000 years ago. This started about 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. And this has been a period of warming. Y'all have all heard the term ice age, right? There was an ice age a long time ago. Well, the ice age came to an end about 1,500 years ago. About 15,000 years ago. And so we are in a warming period. But again, it fluctuates rather substantially. And the glaciers, which extended all the way really to present-day Tennessee, have retreated back. The Great Lakes that we have on the border between the U.S. and Canada, the largest freshwater lakes in the world, those were created as those glaciers dug into the earth and then retreated and left the water behind. And this warming of about 15,000 years ago has also been what has caused human civilization to thrive. Because humans were around during the earlier ice age, but we were hunter-gatherers based on where we were. But as the climate changed, the herds also changed, and of course the food that was growing also changed, and so humans started domesticating animals and cultivating our own food. And so human civilization and human development has been directly tied to what the Earth has been doing. Now, when I say the Earth started warming about 15,000 years ago, you might be inclined to think, well, that's what they're talking about today when we talk about global warming. No, that's definitely not what I'm talking about when I talk about global warming today. The warming that started about 15,000 years ago was incredibly slow, incredibly mild, and incredibly consistent. Beginning about 120 years ago, we started pumping enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide, but also other greenhouse gases like methane. And this has been a result of industrial activity, automobiles, power plants, things like that. We're treating the atmosphere as a garbage can for the waste products of burning fossil fuels. And this has caused the Earth to warm up substantially just in the last 100 years, with it accelerating over about the last 10 or 15. This is definitely not part of the natural cycle of the Earth or the wobbling of the Earth against the sun or anything else. We're the ones doing it. We're the ones doing it. And the warming of the Earth just in the last generation or so has been vastly more than anything that naturally happened within such a short time frame. And we know this to be true. If you're asking yourself, well, how do we know nobody was around, all this time ago? How do we know that the rapid increase in global warming is human created and all of that? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out. We already know that we've been pumping huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We know that increased carbon dioxide is going to heat the Earth up. That's established science. It's not exactly difficult, right? I mean, the evidence is plain as day for somebody in grade school to be able to figure out. When these glaciers are created, although glaciers do move and shift as ice piles up and pushes other ice down, the reality is some of these glaciated areas are very, very, very thick. They're very, very, very thick. And when ice freezes, air bubbles, of course, form in the ice. When ice freezes, it also captures some of its atmosphere and freezes the air within it. And in places like Antarctica, there are ice sheets that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sheets of feet thick, and they are layers of snow that has fallen, like tree rings. Each year another layer of snow falls, and so it creates another layer of ice. And so what we can do is drill core samples down into that ice and just count back the years with each layer of ice. And we can go back a long, long, long way. And within each one of those layers are air bubbles from that particular era. Y'all are following me, right? So we can very easily measure how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 1,000 years ago or whatever, because we can capture the air from that time period in those ice cores. We can also determine how warm the Earth was at any particular era, depending on the era that we're talking about, because we can drill core samples into the sediment of ocean areas. Like, for example, in Antarctica, they've drilled core samples deep, deep, deep down, and of course, much like the ice, sediment settles in the ocean on a consistent basis. So we can go back thousands of years and know what the ocean was like. And if there are tropical animals living where Antarctica is today, that's going to tell you it was warm there, right? And if there's fossils that indicate a very, very cold ocean in an area that is tropical today, we know at this particular time, this part of the Earth was quite a bit colder. This is not hard to figure out, and it's established science. And so I can tell you one thing is absolutely true. The Earth is getting substantially warmer than we have ever experienced before in a very, very brief period of time. And we are doing it. It is our fault. We are the ones responsible for it because we're dumping all of this methane and all this CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, what we don't know is what the impact is really going to be. It's probably not going to be good. We know that because any type of major disruption causes a lot of problems with humans, with our civilization. But it is going to rain a lot more in some places. It's going to dry up in a lot of places, so on and so forth. And that is going to cause massive shifts in population centers, huge disruption in economies. Obviously, if people are living in very, very large numbers and suddenly all the water dries up, these people got to go somewhere, don't they? And so all of a sudden we see environmental refugees. We're already experiencing it in certain parts of the world. And if you look at the American Southwest, it is drier in the American Southwest than it has been in 1,200 years. It is the driest right now. There's a drought going on in the American Southwest that has not existed to that extent for 1,200 years. And again, we know because of these core samples, and we know because of the physical evidence. And it's drying up, and there's millions and millions of people, and an awful lot of crops are growing, and the lack of water could cause tremendous disruption. But let's move on. Climate changes the earth, and you can see how. You know, the glaciers move things. There's also weathering, you know, as the air blows against different geographic features, it wears mountains down, stuff like that. Climate also changes the physical earth. Let's talk about human culture and the physical world. Let's talk about people. Many geographers study what we call cultural geography, the impact that humans have had on the physical world. And remember, geography is what? Everything. You know, again, anytime spatial data gets put on a map, it becomes geography. And so cultural geographers ask all kinds of questions. Cultural geographers ask all kinds of questions. And so I'll ask you a simple question. Maybe somebody could give me an answer. What is culture? What is culture? What makes you a part of a specific culture or not part of a specific culture? What is your culture? That's what it is. Got everything. I got news for you, folks. There is no clear definition of culture. Okay, there is no rock solid, pin it down definition of what culture is. And if you think, oh, I'm a member of a particular culture, you are a member of many cultures. Okay, you are part of many different cultural groups. You overlap with other cultural groups in ways that you don't overlap in others. Culture can be a lot of things. Could culture be national identity? Yes. We're all Americans, right? And there is an American culture that makes us all, you know, hamburgers and apple pie if you are an American, right? Now, are all Americans the same? Of course not, because there's many different racial and ethnic cultures within America, right? So you can be part of American culture, but you can still not share the same culture with your neighbor because you're a different race or a different ethnicity or a different religion, right? You know, you may be radically different from somebody, except y'all both might be Christians, right? And in which case y'all share a culture, but then again, you don't share a culture, right? We often like to define our culture by our race. I got news for you, folks. Not everybody who falls into your racial category is the same culture as you. There's many ways in which you differ from the people who look just like you do and whose ancestors came from where you came from. Not all white people share that same culture. Not all black people share the same culture. Not all Hispanic or Latino people are even the same race. And yet they all consider themselves that. Native Americans. There are many different Native American cultures, yet they're all Native Americans, so they're kind of the same culture, but they're kind of not the same culture, right? Culture can be a lot of things. And so culture, if we really get down to it, is a social construct. We have invented the concept of culture to try to put us into categories. And the minute we try to put ourselves into categories, we end up realizing that these categories are artificial and exceptionally difficult to define. So is culture race? Yes. Well, maybe, maybe not. Because again, not all races are necessarily the same culture, even though we have arbitrarily put ourselves into racial categories. Is culture language? Well, no, not really. Right? Because again, you know, we may speak the same language of the Canadians and the Australians and the New Zealanders and the people in England, but yet there are distinct differences between them. It's like language, right? Lots and lots of people speak Spanish. They are not all part of the same culture, but yet they are because they're all the Spanish speakers, right? But, you know, how do we do this? Is it history? We all share the same history? Well, in some ways we do share the same history. In some ways we don't share the same history, right? Behavior. The things we like to do, the food we like to eat, the music we like to listen to. We could throw religion into that as well. To some extent, we share cultural touchstones with other people. But you may share a lot of behavioral similarities and share a lot of cultural characteristics with people who are radically different from you in all of these other categories. And so culture is really hard to define. The cultural landscape is the impact that humans have had on the Earth's natural physical landscape. The cultural landscape is what we have done to shape the physical Earth to meet our needs. And everybody in here knows that people around the world live very differently from each other. You know, people in South Mississippi live, in many cases, very differently from people in other parts of the world. There's a tremendous diversity in lifestyles. And what we do is we shape the physical earth to meet the lifestyle that we want to have. I got news for you, folks. South Mississippi looks very, very different than it did 100 or 200 years ago. And it looks different in ways that you probably don't even think much about. Obviously, we've built a lot of buildings, put down a lot of concrete, right? We've installed sewer lines, gas lines, electrical lines. We've built roads and highways. None of that stuff existed 150 years ago, right?
We built a beach.
We built a beach. Okay, you have to understand, Biloxi Beach, Gulfport, that is not a natural beach. Mother Nature did not create that. There's nothing natural about the beach when you drive down I-90. That is built by us, constructed by us, because we're on the Gulf Coast and you gotta have a beach on the Gulf Coast. Y'all might not have known that, but the beach is completely artificial, completely created so that we could bring in tourism and we can enjoy the coast more, because who doesn't like sitting in the sand on the beach? In order to have a beach, you have to have wave action. And we don't have wave action. So there you go. So what we have done is radically shaped it. The trees, there's a reason why when you drive on any of our roads, you see nothing but short leaf pine, right? Pines are everywhere. Y'all see that, right? Why is that there? Because that is not what it looked like 200 years ago. Why is it pine as far as the eye can see everywhere in South Mississippi? Because we planted them. We mowed down the old growth forests that were already there, and we planted pine trees. And why are pine trees everywhere? Why pine? Why that specific breed of pine? Lumber, bingo, it grows fast. You know, you can plant those pine trees and within 20 or 25 years you can harvest them and make a lot of money. And so all the people with that land had planted that specific pine because it grows fast, it grows straight, and in your lifetime, you can plant it and then turn around and harvest it a good 20 years later and make a heavy-duty profit. You could do the same thing with oak, but it's going to be your great-grandkids that get the benefit from it, right? Should they cut those trees down. And so that particular type of pine tree is profitable within an adult human lifetime. And it's cheap, and we all build our houses out of it. And so there is pine. It's all across the American South. You know, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, all of those pine trees. The forest is very, very different. And that's only a small part of it. Now, population. Population. How many people are on this planet? How many of us are there? Too many, that's certainly possible. Probably between 7.5 and 8 billion. That's probably what the human population is. And we're growing by 250 to 300 million every 4 years. We're growing by 250 to 300 million every 4 years. When I first started teaching this class, the answer was 6 billion people. Now it's roughly 7.5 billion people. Gives you an idea of how long I've been teaching, right? I still haven't changed my notes. Now, how high will the human population get? How many people can the world sustain? Nobody really knows, because that's not a question with a definitive answer. The earth could sustain, we could have a lot more people than we have on the earth today. Could we have many, many, many billions more people and still be able to enjoy the lifestyle that we enjoy in the developed world? Absolutely not. By most measures, in the developed world, nations like the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, you know, people that live in what we would call the first world like us, by many accounts, we've already gotten overpopulated. by many accounts, the earth cannot sustain how many people are here today if everybody in the world lived like Americans live, right? If everybody in the world had the same lifestyle as us, used as many resources as we use, used as much electricity, as much water, as much as it takes to grow all the food that we eat, the earth would be stripped dry. We'd be in, Mad Max land within a couple of decades. But could we sustain many, many billions more if we radically cut back how we live, if we radically cut back our energy use, our land use, etc.? Yes, the earth could. And so there we have it. Most experts, or I wouldn't say most, but there is a going argument that the earth is probably going to top out at around 11 billion. Once we hit about 11 billion, we're going to start seeing a population shift where we kind of stick it at about right there. Oddly enough, in developed nations, nations like the United States and France and Britain, the first world, we have much lower population growth. Once people move themselves into the middle and upper middle classes, once we have what we would consider to be a comfortable lifestyle, we choose not to have lots of kids. We choose to have the 2 or 3, and that's the end of it because we want to maintain our lifestyle. In lesser developed places, in places like Africa and South Asia and South America, the people who are much poorer than us and don't have the development that we have, they tend to have lots and lots and lots of children. And so we're seeing tremendous population growth, for example, in Africa. But in the United States, we're not seeing that. And in some parts of the world that are highly developed, they're actually seeing a population decline. Japan, for example, is seeing its population go down because the people in Japan don't have a lot of space. It's very expensive to live, and they enjoy their comfortable lifestyles. And so the Japanese are deliberately choosing to have very few children because you're not going to have a nice big SUV, well, not in Japan anyway, but you're not going to have a nice car and a nice home and get to enjoy all kinds of nice stuff if you have 8 kids, right? That ain't going to happen. But in Africa, you have all the kids you want. It doesn't really change anything. Yeah.
I thought they limited the amount of kids you could have.
That's China. That's China. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. China was experiencing what they considered to be overpopulation because they were in a very underdeveloped nation like other parts of the world. And the traditional Chinese lifestyle, like in a lot of agrarian cultures, was lots of kids because children are a benefit. Farmers like to have lots of kids. And then China wanted to rapidly develop. And so during the Mao era of China, the government decided there's too many of us and you only get to have 1 kid. And that caused all kinds of problems. That turned out to be a big mess for China.
Estimated 300 million more males than females.
Yeah, because it turns out, and this is how culture is so radically different. When the government forcibly told couples you only get to have 1 child, they wanted to have boys rather than girls. Because in China, the son is an economic supporter of the parents, and having a son is more prestigious and better. And so what ended up happening is when women got pregnant, if they found out it was a girl, they would get an abortion, and then they would try again until they had a boy. And so lots and lots and lots of abortions took place of female fetuses. And then what ended up happening is that many, many, many more men were born, or boys were born, and now they are coming into maturity. And that ain't good because without that population balance, these men can't find wives. There's not women for them because there's such an imbalance. And again, the reason why that's culturally so unique, because obviously technology has enabled infertile couples in the developed world to get pregnant. A lot of times, obviously, it doesn't always work. But y'all have heard of IVF and all of that. Generally speaking, if you're going to go through fertility treatment as a couple, you're just going to end up having 1 kid, right? You're going to do it once because it's so expensive and so difficult and so time consuming. If a couple is infertile and they're going through that complicated treatment, and you can choose your embryos. They fertilize like 10 embryos and then you choose the ones you want. And given a choice to have 1 child, what do the American couples want?
Boys.
They want girls. They want girls. If you can have 1 child and that's all you're going to get in the United States and in the developed part of the world, people overwhelmingly say, I'd rather have a girl than a boy, even though in China they'd rather have a boy than a girl. Now, why would so many couples say, you know what, I'd rather have a girl than a boy in the United States? Why is that?
Because it's easier.
Oh, no. As a father of a 13-year-old, I can assure you it's not easier.
I mean, the clothes are cheaper.
No, not even close. Again, as a father of a 13-year-old, I can assure you it is. My daughter is substantially more expensive than my son, although he ain't cheap either. In Western culture, who takes care of mom and dad? I mean, everyone in here's got grandparents, right? Who's looking after grandma and grandpa? Who goes over there? Who brings them meals? Who takes care of them? Who does all of that? Mostly it's mom, isn't it? It's mostly the women that care for the elderly as we get into the modern era. The women seem to put more energy into that. The girls tend to stay closer to home. Whenever the grandchildren come along, it's the girls' children that spend more time with grandma and grandpa. When the boy gets married, his wife takes the kids to her family, right? You know, when the son, y'all see where I'm coming from, right? And y'all can think about that in your own lives. I mean, when it comes to that sort of family connection and family care, girls are far more connected. And so mom and dad want to have a girl. You know, mom and dad want to have a girl. Above all else, I suppose you want to have healthy children, and that's great. But I can assure you, God has a sense of humor. So if all you want is healthy children, you might want to expand what you're praying for here, folks. Okay? But in any event, humans are not evenly dispersed upon, we're going to do a lot of going off on different tangents here because that's geography, it's everything. Humans are not evenly dispersed across the planet. There's actually an awful lot of land out there. But you can't see this, can you? We have put ourselves into population clusters. Some parts of the earth are very, very dense in terms of population. Some parts of the earth are flat out uninhabited or very sparsely inhabited. And this has to do with many factors. Obviously, the ability to live has a lot to do with that. It's not surprising there aren't many people living in the Sahara Desert, right? You know, Western China, which is very, very mountainous and rugged, not many people because you can't really have a thriving civilization in mountains of that scale. As a general rule, human populations grow the largest near coastlines. Human populations grow the largest near coastlines. And that is because trade and commerce and prosperity tends to concentrate along coastlines. And nations and people with lots of good coastline tend to do better than nations without that. That's one reason why the United States is so incredibly prosperous and powerful. We have enormous coastlines on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And when you look at the world, very few nations are in our situation. From sea to shining sea. There's a reason why that lyric is in there. It is an amazing, amazing advantage for the United States.
It only took a little genocide.
Oh, it took a lot, actually. But hey, Polk won in California, okay? James K. Polk won in California.
It really did.
As the former editor of James K. Polk's papers, I'm not going to put the man down. Okay. Urban versus rural. Or let's look at a few things. Let's look at this real quick. Obviously, we also have great diversity in terms of development and general economic prosperity. Some parts of the world are quite wealthy. Some parts of the world are, of course, very poor. And we can see these kind of concentrate. You know, these kinds of concentrate in regions. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody in North America and Australia is wealthy. Obviously, plenty of poor people exist in developed nations, right? Plenty of poor people exist in places that are considered rather affluent, and there are no shortage of rich people in areas that are generally poor. So what we're talking about is the general economic landscape, the general economic quality of life, not the specific. We're looking at the macro, not the micro. You know, there's no shortage of poor people in Europe, even though Europe is particularly developed. It is worth noting that one way to look at how prosperous or how good of a quality of life you have in an area is just pure economic development. You know, the United States is a wealthy nation. We most definitely are, right? France, Britain, Japan, Australia, wealthy nations, no question about it, even though we know there's plenty of poor people there. Another way to look at it is opportunity. Another way to look at it is opportunity. If you're born down here, even if you're born in a well-off country, if you're born down here, how easy is it for you to get up here? What kind of opportunity do you have to advance, right? You're born poor, but can you die rich? Nations and cultures that have an open track for people to move up are definitely better off than nations where social status is locked in and it's particularly difficult to move up. And that is absolutely the case around the world. Some cultures encourage individual achievement. Other countries want you to stay where you are because order and structure require you to know your place. China doesn't offer a lot of upward mobility. And so even though China is a relatively wealthy economy, or it's a growing economy, it's still a poor nation, but it's the second largest economy in the world, traditionally China didn't allow people to move up very easily. And so that was a big problem for China. In the United States, we pride ourselves on our ability to enable you to move up. I got news for you, okay? Your wealth and prosperity has nothing to do necessarily with how much money you actually have or what kind of job you actually have. It has to do with how capable you are of achieving that. Because there's no shortcut to the top. You have to embrace that. You have to embrace that one simple concept. If you were lucky enough to choose the right parents and be born rich, good for you, right? If you win the lottery, you have to give me some, okay? That's just how it is, right? We're cool, but I want a piece of it. For all but a very select, very lucky few of us, the only way you're going to end up here is for you to work your butt off. You have to be forward thinking, you have to be ambitious, you have to decide, I'm going to get it. There are lots of very poor people or very modest people that have found their way to the top by simply applying themselves and being industrious and being forward thinking and investing in themselves. And does our nation give you that opportunity? You better believe it does. Okay, you better believe it does. There is no shortage of millionaires that graduated from Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. Okay, there are no shortage of people that had a lot of money and a very, very good lifestyle that were sitting in the very seat you are sitting in right now. And the only difference between you and them is that you're younger than them and they were willing to apply themselves and work really hard. You make straight A's, you say I'm going to do well in life, you say I'm going to keep working until it gets there, your chances are pretty darn good. Your chances are pretty darn good. So the fact that you are now sitting in this seat and you have the opportunity to get this degree and you have these opportunities in front of you, it also means you don't get to complain later on if you don't put the effort in and don't end up doing well, right? Because you got your chance. You've got your opportunity. It never happens without working hard. There is no shortcut. So wealthy nations are nations that provide opportunity, right? Wealthy nations are nations that provide that upward mobility track. They are not nations that just give people stuff without working for it. And the sooner you embrace the idea that there are no shortcuts and so looking for them isn't going to work, the sooner you embrace that, the better off you're going to be. You could also look at how prosperous a nation is, or how prosperous a region is, by the lifestyle opportunities. By the lifestyle opportunities. One nice thing about being American is that if you want to live where it's cold, you can live where it's cold, right? If you want to live by the beach, you can live by the beach. If you want to live in the mountains, you can live in the mountains. If you like to, if you like to look out and see nothing but blue sky, you can move to Montana. There's all types of physical geography, all types of opportunities. If you want to live in a rural area where you can't see your neighbors, you've got that chance, right? If you want to live in a densely packed urban area, go for it. Other nations that may be affluent and may be prosperous do not afford those opportunities. If you decide to live in Denmark, which has a very high standard of living, you ain't going to live where it's nice and warm, where we can put our toes in the sand of our artificial beach, right? It's a cold country and it's a swampy country. The same is true with Finland, which is a pretty prosperous nation. It's moved forward pretty nicely, but it's dark. Literally, the sun doesn't come up for 6 months out of the year in the entire country. So if you don't like snow, don't move to Scandinavia. That's the only opportunity you have. And so some nations might have a higher standard of living by some measures, but they definitely do not afford the same opportunities by many others. So there's a lot of ways to define that. Here is North America. We're not quite there yet. Urban versus rural. Urban versus rural. Generally speaking, an urban area contains at least 2,500 people characteristics of modern development, meaning electricity, water, trash collection, sewage, places to buy food, so on and so forth. Rural areas, of course, are what we would often consider to be the country. But what does it really mean to be rural? Well, in the United States, rural people don't necessarily see their neighbors, right? You know, living in the country means there's a lot of space. But as we have developed as a nation, rural people mostly live the same as urban people. Rural people live in the same houses, they have trash collection, they have water, they have electricity, they have high-speed internet. You know, in terms of your amenities, there's not that much difference between urban and rural in the United States, except how long it takes you to drive to the Walmart, right? Now, other parts of the world, that is definitely not the case. If you go to India, for example, rural people are still living without any of that stuff. I mean, rural people in India still live in huts. But of course, India has very modern cities with modern amenities. And of course, an urban area, what we would often call a city, doesn't necessarily have to be an incorporated political city. Many people live in, quote unquote, the county, even though you would never know it by looking at their neighborhood or the way they live. Because Biloxi, Gulfport, D'Iberville, so on and so forth are political entities that have borders that stop, but the housing developments and the shopping centers and so on go into what is technically rural areas. And so the line gets very blurry between urban and rural as well, depending on where you live. Rural Wayne County is as far in the backwoods as you're going to find anywhere in this country. But the people in rural Wayne County drive modern vehicles, right? They have electricity, they have water, the trash picks up. There are people in rural Wayne County that have fiber optic internet, and I live in a city here on the coast and I don't have it, right? So again, it gets, and I'm mad about that, by the way. I'm really going to put those fiber lines in. I want my fiber, folks. So there you go. States, what's a state? We use the word state a lot. We use the word state a lot. What's a state? Well, the first thing you might think when we say a state is a state like in the United States, right? Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia. We all know what a state is, right? Well, no. Okay, for our purposes, a state is a nation. A state is a country. The United States is a state. France is a state. Mexico is a state. You get the idea. And our founding fathers had their own sort of unique concept of what the individual states were, which is why we are called the United States of America. They did not expect at the beginning in 1776 for our federal government to have much power at all. We were more or less a confederation of little independent countries that sort of agreed to work together. And when we realized that that didn't work at all, we decided to write our Constitution and give our federal government significantly more power. And even then, they didn't really plan on it having nearly as much power as we did after the Civil War. But in the earliest days of our country, each state was actually very, very politically independent. Remember to stay off your phone, please. Each state was quite independent. That's why we use the word states to define Mississippi and Alabama and whatever. So what exactly makes a state a state? What makes a country a country? Well, you gotta have a few characteristics, and we call this the European state model. A modern definition of what makes a state or not a state. So what does a state have to have under the European state model that makes it a state? Well, first of all, it needs to have more or less clearly defined geographical borders. It needs to have clearly defined geographical borders. They can be big or they can be very small. Monaco is 1/3 the size of New York Central Park, but those borders are clearly defined, and so it counts. Clearly defined political borders. Now, of course, there are border disputes all over the world, where two states argue over exactly where the borders are, but nonetheless, if we get close, we're going to say that that fits. Secondly, a state has to have a clear political capital. There needs to be a capital city of some sort that governs the state. What is the capital of the United States? Washington DC, it should not have taken you anywhere near that long to answer that question, right? What is the capital of England? London, right? What is the capital of France? Paris, of course. What is the capital of Mexico?
That's an original name.
What's the capital of Mexico? Mexico City, of course, right? All right, here's a real fun one. What's the capital of Australia?
Sydney?
Nope, good answer. Most people think it is. It's actually Canberra. And the reason why I say that is because the capital doesn't have to be the big city, right? Capitals are often small. You know, capitals are often considerably smaller than other large urban areas in a particular nation. And so most people think, oh, it's got to be Sydney, right? If I were to say name one city in Australia, most people say Sydney. And then I say name another city in Australia and, crickets, right? Well, of course, there's Adelaide, there's Melbourne, there's a lot of cities in Australia, of course. But the capital is Canberra. The capital is Canberra.
British Columbia is like that. Victoria's the capital.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks Vancouver is.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly right. People think it's Vancouver. How about this one? They're just to the north. Capital of Canada. Oh, y'all should know this. I mean, they're right there. They're our neighbors.
I hate
Ottawa. Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Okay, so we got to have our borders. We have to have a political capital. We also have to have diplomatic relations and recognition by the other states of the world. Everyone else has to say, yep, you're a state, and have some form of diplomatic relationship. Now, again, that can be a very vague diplomatic relationship. North Korea, for example, doesn't necessarily have much to do with anybody, but North Korea has a relationship with China. North Korea has a relationship with other nations, even though they don't like us.
Taiwan's a good example of that.
Yeah, and well, Taiwan is a good example of not a state, right? Because Taiwan is sort of a state, but sort of not. And so there are lots of areas in the world where we can't necessarily apply that model uniformly, which is why we have to make that distinction. Palestine and Israel is another good example. The borders are not clearly defined, and there's still a lot of dispute, even though the United States recognizes Israel and absolutely, without a question, says Israel is a state. There's plenty of nations in the world that do not, and so Israel is also a conflicted area. Now, why is this particularly important? Because you can't just claim your own state, right? You can't just decide, I'm the state of Trevor and, my house is its own independent country. Sorry, it doesn't work that way, right? I don't have a political capital. I don't have diplomatic recognition by anybody else. Lots of people decide, I don't belong to the United States anymore, I'm a sovereign citizen or anything like that. Those people are idiots. I mean, they really are idiots. Because they don't have any problem, accepting protection from our army. They don't have any problem using our water, driving on our roads, using the electricity. Newsflash, you're in the United States, you're an American. You don't get to unilaterally declare yourself. Nothing. Sometimes states try to become states and don't end up succeeding. And living in Mississippi, we've got a great example of that. What's that?
It was a movie with Matthew.
No, not a movie. Us. When did we decide we were going to become our own state? Civil War, absolutely. In 1861, Mississippi, along with a bunch of other southern states, declared themselves independent from the USA, right? Became the Confederate States of America. Set up all of the touchstones of a state, clearly defined borders, political capital, et cetera, but no other nation in the world was willing to recognize the Confederacy, and the United States crushed the Confederacy militarily, and so the Confederate States of America faded away and ceased to exist in 1865. And so no, the Confederate States of America was not a state. It was not a nation by the European state model, even though it came close. And speaking of coming close, we're out of time. So I will see everybody. Now look, I'm going to be putting up material. Okay, I will absolutely be putting up materials on Chat by Friday, and there's going to be notes for you to study. All right, y'all take care.